Liberating Visions, Human Fulfillment and Social Justice in African American Thought, authored by Robert Michael Franklin. Third person you invited to dinner was Malcolm Little. We know him as Malcolm X. You described him, the metaphor you used was defiant life.
Well, Malcolm experienced enormous tragedies early in his life. Unlike Booker T. Washington, unlike Du Bois, Malcolm was really part of the phenomena of urban poverty, urban privation, and the challenges of a family coming apart, being fragmented by the forces of the big city. Malcolm's father was killed by fault of his trying to protest the racism in his town. And then his mother, with the loss of her father and with these now, I think, 7 or 8 children to rear, just the strain of that, ultimately she kind of decompensated. And so she was institutionalized, and so there were the kids being split up, and this is Malcolm spending his childhood in this kind of emotional, psychological context. So he's an angry kid, and there are a lot of angry kids out there, black, white, brown, of all our communities. And Malcolm helps us peer through the window of what makes some of our kids, especially the boys that I'm interested in, what makes them so angry? What makes them want to strike out at other people who are innocent, who are really not responsible for their condition? So again, Malcolm's anger and where it leads him, the bad decisions this young man makes. And he's ultimately in the crime world, he's engaged in drugs and this and that, and then finally finds himself in prison. And that becomes, as I talk about it, the incubator for his intellectual and spiritual transformation. And interestingly, it is through this rather cult-like religious organization, the Nation of Islam, that he experiences his conversion and joins that group. Of course, is a true believer, believes it all literally, and then is disaffected when he learns that the leader has engaged in some hypocritical behavior. So he leaves that and becomes his own voice, and that's where he really becomes interesting for me as a free agent, as a thinking moral agent. And but it's that fight in him that drives him, that suggests for me the metaphor of the defiant life. And again, I use that today as I engage some of these young men, as I say, in many of our big cities, who are lost, who are angry, who are searching. And I insist, you need to sit down and read the Autobiography of Malcolm X and see how your life can come out in a different place. And you can become a thinker and a real citizen and a real contributor to life. So,
did he Malcolm X find himself stereotyped at the end so that they knew him more or less as affiliated with Elijah Muhammad? You wonderfully put in it that Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm felt that salvation entailed the full enjoyment of freedom, justice, equality, and peace in a territory governed by blacks under the crescent of Islam. Sort of an isolationist organization.
That's right. That's right.
Did he feel once he tried to disengage, he couldn't?
It was very difficult for him because we had now, 12 years of his black separatist rhetoric and the separatist Islamic rhetoric, and only a year and a half of the new Malcolm, as it were. He was silenced following the assassination of President Kennedy, and so that's November '63. Well, Malcolm is killed himself by February of '65 by members of the Nation of Islam who wanted to silence him. So we just had that full year of 1964, interesting, 50 years ago, where he was sort of doing some new things and making moves that surprised people, reaching out to Martin Luther King, trying to bridge the chasms. and apologizing. There's amazing humility there, apologizing, to the white community and the white leaders who had done so much good to help African Americans who were allies. He says, I pushed people away whom I should never have pushed away, and I feel badly about them. And so there's that kind of humility and intellectual honesty that I think Malcolm offers us that gift, but we don't often see it because of the stereotype.
Your last person to the table, Martin Luther King Jr., and you used the metaphor integrative life, and not to be confused with integrated life. Draw the distinction.
Well, I didn't want the term integrated to suggest assimilated and conforming, but rather the moral life for Martin Luther King is a life that brings together, that integrates a variety of elements. He had a wonderful sermon called the Three Dimensions of a Complete Life. I argue that it was his favorite sermon because it was a trial sermon he preached when he began his ministry at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954. And then the message he utilized 10 years later in Oslo when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He used that same fundamental message. There are three dimensions of a complete life. And it's that integration of dimension one, the length of life, the extent to which each of us actualizes all of our inner potential. So the length of life is not how long you live in years, but what you do with the length of that life. Then he says there's the breadth of life. It's how far we reach out to connect to others in service. And then the height of life is as he puts it, the soul's upward reach toward God. And he says we bring these three dimensions together. For me, that struck me as an integrative vision and a process that's ongoing. Integrated also suggested that it's a completed process. And I think King would say, no, it's an ongoing, we never quite complete that process.
If you had two more chairs to the table after this 1990 book, who would you add?
One of them would be Marian Wright Edelman. I felt uncomfortable with the book in that there were no women in it. I think that this, however, a function of the kind of patriarchal times where often women were not permitted to or encouraged to write extensively and publish in these topics. And so as a grad student, one of the challenges was simply finding enough material. Mind you, this is back in the 70s. We've now found quite a bit of material we didn't know existed at the time. And so I needed enough to write a dissertation, a chapter on each of these people. And so Marian Wright Edelman would certainly stand, it would be a part of this conversation. The way in which she has prioritized children, has focused on family renewal, but also has been a strong advocate for policy change and working within government, within the system to produce changes that represent justice and compassion. And so in a way she sort of takes a step beyond the gentleman that I highlighted. And then I'd say probably Nelson Mandela, just to bring a global dimension to this conversation that is very American, but one who had an impact on America and I think all societies. The cost of having a conscience, the cost of discipleship, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote about it. And Nelson Mandela, more than any of these figures, represents that. None of them spent 27 years in prison and then departs with a spirit of reconciliation and humility, and then is elected president of the country. So that's just such a remarkable story, and one I think I'd want to encourage certainly the next generation to pay more attention.